You probably think you know how the past behaves. Tidy layers of soil, neat museum labels, radiocarbon dates that slot human stories into rows. We like history like that, organized, clickable, digestible for a thumbnail. But the world keeps a different ledger under its feet, one that refuses to be neat. Buried between the pottery shards and the bones there are sentences that hum with a voice we almost recognize and then refuse to understand. Lines that speak of beings who fell, of skies that open like a door, of laws that were given and then stolen. If you came here expecting an archaeological lecture, prepare to be unsettled. If you came here for comfort, know now that we are going to wander, together, into places where the evidence gets slippery and the stories get loud. I promise you this, by the time we finish, you will carry new questions in your pockets, questions that will not leave you alone at night. You will hear names you might once have dismissed as myth, and see them refract through shards of clay and slag of metal into something startlingly human. There will be big revelations, decoded inscriptions that reframe old myths, and there will be unanswered questions, wide and patient. The point of this journey is not to hand you definitive answers but to teach you how to stand with uncertainty and let it work on you, to learn how to read the spaces between the lines. We are not just spectators, we are implicated, because the ghosts we read about are, in one way or another, our ancestors' greatest anxieties given text. Think of the first time a fallen tree opened a path through the forest and, for the first time, light spilled on a rock no one had seen before. That's what these tablets feel like, unexpected sunlight on a stone that has been keeping secrets for millennia. The new passages I'll read aloud to you today are not the dry, law-like commands you might have expected from an ancient scribe. They are fragments of argument and apology and astonishment, voices arguing over who had the right to descend, voices trying to name the sensations of flight and weightlessness, voices making metaphors out of human gestures, hands, mouths, offspring. Because the catalogue of the divine, to them, had to be stretched into the language of the economy. That language is messy. It betrays the scribe's embarrassment at the very thing they are describing. That is what makes the tablets so urgent to us. They are intimate, halting, sometimes contradictory, and often terrifying. So let us walk slowly. Picture yourself in a dim tent at dawn, a breeze sneaking under the canvas, a lantern guttering beside a stack of clay tablets. You hold one and read words that someone not so different from you, pressed into wet clay when the world was young and the sky had not yet been tamed. Our first stop together will be a stone circle that predates written history as we usually define it. The excavation team found, near its eastern axis, a sealed cache. Inside were thin clay tablets, baked hard by an ancient kiln, small, no longer than your hand, but covered in a script that runs like stitching across their faces. The new readings of these tablets, what some are already calling the passages about the fallen, do not match the tidy categories of gods and men. The texts describe descent not as metaphor but as action, columns of motion, measurements of time and breaths, lists of clothing and contraband, and startlingly, names for the sky as if it were a city with gates and guards. There are pleas, too, and inventory-like accounts of what the descended took, metals, seeds, women's weaving techniques, items that read like trade goods and like taboo. When you listen to the syntax of these lines, you hear an argument unfolding, a bureaucratic quarrel about what belongs to whom. It is not simply theology, it is property law from a cosmology bent on being human. But here's where it gets tricky. The stone circle itself, which anchors the first of our mysteries, sits on a plane that archaeologists once dated to roughly 9,600 to 8,200 BC, during the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B transition. The pillars stand between 3 and 6 meters high, some with limestone carvings that show abstracted animals and human figures with arms raised in what could be prayer, or in what could be a gesture of falling. Nearby, obsidian flakes map a trade network that seems to stretch hundreds of kilometers, clear evidence that the people who built this site were not isolated hill dwellers but participants in long exchange routes that connected coasts with mountains. The tablets, however, complicate everything. Their language is not one we can slot easily into known family trees. Certain idioms echo the later Near Eastern mythopoetic forms, the catalogue of watchers, the Enochic material you may recognize in later Jewish traditions, But they are also older by thousands of years if the stratigraphy is right. These are not citations. They are cousins, shared motifs that suggest a very long memory stretching backward across time. Now, let's be fair, there are practical explanations for almost everything we find. A skeptical mind will point out that human beings have always anthropomorphized the sky. They have always told stories to regulate behavior and to keep the social order. The descent could be a poetic image for migration, or for elite craftsmen who, by their skills, appeared godlike to less technological communities. The stolen goods could be a metaphor for prestige technologies moving along trade routes. Obsidian here, flint there, new weaving patterns that change a society's female economy. Still, for all the evidence of trade and cultural diffusion, the tablets go on to record measurements of time in a way that seems literal. Breaths counted, nights named, and a device for marking how long a descended figure remained in the human village. That specificity makes it hard to dismiss everything as mere metaphor. Competing theories proliferate like spring grass around the circle. One camp, let's call them the technological diffusionists, argues that these passages encode memory of early metallurgy and of specialists who taught metallurgy, agriculture, and weaving to neighboring groups. Their descent is pedagogical. Another camp, the ritualists, sees the language as entirely symbolic, a mythic charter legitimizing new temples' claims over land and marriage rights. A third, more controversial group, call them the sky myth reconstructionists, takes the tablets at something closer to face value, reading them as memories of a crossed boundary between heaven and earth, a porous interface that permitted beings of a different order to interact with humans and, to use the text's blunt language, take. Then there is a growing, uneasy fourth reading, pushed by poet scholars and a handful of field archaeologists who suggest the texts reveal not just contact but miscegenation, hints, in passing, of offspring that do not fit neatly into human genealogies. The implication is incendiary because it restores agency to the beings described. It suggests a reciprocity that is morally ambiguous and historically explosive. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn toward that circle. The pillars loom like the ribs of some enormous sleeping animal. You will breathe in the earth's odor, crushed limestone, old smoke, the faint tang of ancient fecundity. Imagine a tablet in your palm and the words pressing slightly into your skin, anachronistic, impossible. The tablets invite you to imagine civilization as porous, a place where technology traveled by the pheromones of trade and where the sacred was not safely fenced off but bled into domestic life. That is the human wonder at the heart of this site. The same hands that shaped pots also shaped cosmology. To close the distance between the stone and the clay and the human is to feel kinship with people whose ethical questions were, in truth, ours too. We still don't know whether those passages record history, metaphor, ritual, or some unstable mix of all three, and the tablets refuse to be reduced to a single explanation. Here, in the first mystery, we find the critical tension that will recur again and again. The archaeological record is resolutely material: pottery shards, post holes, skeletons, while the tablet text insists on a spiritual economy. Reconciling one to the other requires imagination grounded in method. The stone circles radiocarbon dates, the measurement of pillar heights, the obsidian sourcing, the microscopic wear on matate stones. These are facts that anchor the site in the landscape. The passages about the fallen are words that disturb that anchor by introducing agencies that cross human metaphors into lived practice. How do we account for a world in which myths appear to have been written by people who had intimate experience with whatever those myths aim to explain? Do we let the text expand our categories? Or do we keep the texts boxed in as artful fictions that tell us more about social anxieties than about real events? This is not academic hairsplitting. The answers change how we interpret everything from ancient law to family structure. Still, for all the evidence and for all the brilliant debates it has inspired, one line from those tablets keeps echoing in the camp at night, an almost parenthetical note, a scribe's aside. We counted breaths and we named the gate, yet the gate remained open. We still don't know what that implies about the boundary between the human and the otherwise. The second mystery we will visit is dominated by trade and by sea, an island harbor where fragments of metal and bone were found mixed with the remains of what once looked like an enormous communal hall. The one-sentence teaser is simple and chilling. This harbor once housed strangers who arrived in vessels under night skies and left behind small inscribed shards describing laws for hybrid children. The site's dating is later, roughly 2000 to 1200 BC, falls within the Late Bronze Age, and the material culture shows clear Mycenaean and Anatolian influences. Measurements matter here. The harbor's fixed channel is roughly 60 meters wide, able to accept ships with hull lengths approaching 12 to 15 meters. There are traces of foreign rivets and metallurgical slag, the residue of onboard repairs, alongside human bones that show an odd mix of dietary isotopes, as if some residents ate more marine protein than their inland neighbors. Add to this a handful of tablets, brittle, sun-baked shards, inscribed in a script that borrows signs from Linear A and early Anatolian syllabaries, and you have an uneasy marriage of artifact and inscription that points to long-distance contacts and to social hybridity. As we unpack this harbor story, several things become clear. First, the material evidence, rivet fragments, imported amphorae, and trade weights, indicates a bustling port engaged in exchange of resin, copper, and possibly timber. Second, the osteological record is telling. A few skeletons show pathologies typical of seafaring life. Ear osteomas from repeated cold water exposure, healed fractures consistent with deck accidents, while others show isotopic signatures that imply inland diets. The tablets themselves, when reassembled, contain short legal clauses. One fragment insists that the child of the stranger and the housewife shall be given a name each by both ports, while another lists restrictions on landholding for such children. They may till but not preside in council until the third harvest. Taken together, the shards sound like the codification of a community negotiating hybridity, people of different origins intermarrying, children who did not fit established lineage charts, and a community trying to invent laws to accommodate them. Now, let's be fair, there are institutional reasons to craft such clauses. Ports are cosmopolitan and messy. They require quick legal improvisation to smooth conflicts and to integrate new labor. Laws about children and landholding may be mundane administrative responses. Still, the tablet fragments include a phrase that jars with purely civic language, a curse formula that implores the watchers of the mouthless sky to witness and to enforce the law. It reads like a legal text one moment and a charm the next, a hybrid literary form that refuses clean classification. This hybridization of form resonates with the hybridization of bodies on the island. Some scholars argue for a metaphorical interpretation, invoking the watchers was a way to dramatize the law's weight without implying actual non-human witnesses. Others, poets and a few risk-taking epigraphists, suggest these formulas are survivals of older cosmologies that were repurposed to give legal pronouncements spiritual force. Imagine walking the slick quay at dawn when the fishermen are already hauling nets and gulls wheel above the boats. The smell is of salt and rotting kelp, the light slants like a promise. You hold a shard and feel the score of a stylus, the indent of a thumb. Picture, too, the people who once inhabited those houses, women with looms that hummed, men with calloused hands from oars and ropes, children with salt-creased hair and laughter that rose above the harbor din. In that human chorus, the tablets are blunt instruments of social engineering. They attempt to hold differences in place. The reflective insight here is stark. Hybridity, biological, cultural, and legal, forces societies to invent categories. Those inventions tell us as much about the anxiety of borders as they do about the generosity of exchange. We still don't know whether the watchers invoked were literal participants in these social arrangements, or literary devices elegized to shore up fragile laws. Each of these sites, and the tablets that accompany them, raises the same stubborn question: what do we do when a text insists on agency beyond human actors? The material record pushes back, insisting on measurements and sequences and bones. The texts press forward, insisting on experience, on intentionality, on names and debts. Our job as readers, yours and mine, is not to choose a side but to learn to listen to the dissonance, and to accept that truth may be a braided thing. For now, the circle's pillars and the harbor's shards are our teachers. And still, even with the tablets that have been decoded, with the maps and isotopes and careful typologies, one phrase refuses to resolve itself into either explanation. They came in winter, with little light, and claimed the children as their ledger. We still don't know what ledger that was, or whose name it recorded, or whether the children listed were a resource or a promise. The next place we must go is a place of light so harsh it feels like an accusation, a desert ruin where a collapsed archive once kept a city's memory. The one-sentence teaser is blunt. The librarians here recorded visitors from the sky and gave them titles like teacher and contractor, and the fragments left behind read like lesson plans for forbidden knowledge. The city sat on a dry riverbed that archaeologists now date to the early 1st millennium BC, around 900 to 700 BC, in a cultural horizon that shows the imprint of competing polities. Pottery styles that borrow from the plateau to the west, seal motifs that travel from the south, and an administrative handwriting that suggests trained scribes. The architecture is measured, streets planned in modules roughly 6 by 12 meters, storerooms aligned to let prevailing winds cool the granaries, and the ruins preserve evidence of a significant literacy economy, stamped seals, inkstones, a large central room with benches and niches that could have been a school. Among the collapsed strata, conservators found a sealed jar that yielded thin, fragile sheets of bark and copper leaves inscribed in a mixture of cursive signs and pictograms. The content, when pieced together, reads like syllabus fragments. Teach the seed, do not return without payment, measure the child at 10 months, do not let the memory be eaten by the wind. The language, if that is what we can call it, has verbs that insist on pedagogy, to teach, to bind, to promise. Whatever the city's people were cataloging, it was not mere myth, it was instruction, and that instruction named beings who are not wholly human. But here's where it gets tricky. The copper leaves are technologically interesting. Metallurgical analysis shows traces of arsenical copper alloying that hints at metallurgical knowledge older than the city's supposed founding and possibly transmitted by mobile specialists. The bark sheets, treated with an oily coating to prevent decay, bear fingerprints and smudges that, microscopically analyzed, match patterns seen on domestic items, suggesting these records were handled by ordinary hands as well as by elite scribes. Trade routes intersected here. A lake, now vanished, once lay 50 kilometers north and may have funneled goods and ideas through the city. The teachers, the inscriptions mentioned are described with terms that could be professional, craftsman, teacher, healer, and with titles that sound like offices, keeper of numbers, namer of the sky. This dual register, administrative and mythic, produces a text that reads simultaneously as census and catechism. Now, let's be fair. A practical mind will note that any community that trains specialists needs a manual. The presence of lesson fragments could simply reflect a bureaucratic need to preserve technique. Yet the student exercises are odd. One exercise asks the student to recite the house of the watcher, and then to list the goods the watcher accepted as tuition: metals, woven cloths, animal teeth. Another passage instructs how to bind a child's wrist. To remember the night of descent. The specificity is unsettling. It does not sound like metaphor designed to encourage apprentices. It reads like a memory of embodied transactions. Scholars argue. Some anthropologists suggest these are initiation rites recorded in register form, a community trying to bureaucratize a ritual. Epigraphists point out formal parallels to other Near Eastern pedagogical texts, but the imagery here is unusual. Invocations that place teachers at thresholds between households and skies. Poets and a few field archaeologists dare to suggest that these teachers were social agents who crossed boundaries. Perhaps they were itinerant masters who taught advanced horticulture and metalwork, but perhaps, in the experience of the scribes, their manner of coming was remembered as falling. The ambiguity is the archive's true voice. Picture yourself stepping into the ruin at noon, the sun striking like a hammer, the heat making the air shimmer. You squint and move between fallen walls. The benches are bleached, and the alcoves that once held jars are filled with drifting sand. Imagine unfolding a bark sheet and feeling the ghost of someone's hand where an index finger once traced a line. The Tablets Pedagogy opens a window. These people did not simply fear the unknown. They tried to domesticate it with lesson plans and registration, turning wonder into practice and practice into law. The human wonder here is precise and mortal, that we are always trying to teach and thereby control what terrifies us, to transform the uncanny into a syllabus. We still don't know whether the teachers were human specialists remembered with mythic language or a genuinely different order of beings who participated in the social reproduction of knowledge. From the burning plain we head up into the high country, where the wind bites and the stone is thin and brittle. An alpine cave shrine awaits that will test your appetite for the sensational. The teaser is the kind that lingers in the mind. The cave yielded bones of impossible scale and votive stones carved with handprints that are larger than any recorded human hand. The site sits at 2,400 meters above sea level and was used intermittently from roughly 1,200 BC through the late 1st millennium CE. The cave's inner chamber narrows to a throat, then opens into a vaulted hollow where hearths were kept and where offerings, animal bones, chipped tools, and those carved stones, were placed on ledges. The most arresting finds are a series of megalithic slabs bearing incised impressions of palms and fingers, each print magnified by roughly a third beyond average human dimensions. Nearby, at a lower layer dated by AMS radiocarbon to around 400 to 200 BC, archaeologists uncovered partial skeletal remains, a femur with a robust shaft much thicker than typical Homo sapiens, a mandibular fragment of unusual proportions. Osteologists are cautious, but they also admit the morphology is atypical. Measurements matter. The femoral shaft circumference suggests a stature that, when extrapolated, might place these individuals at well over 2.5 meters tall. If taken literally, the bones suggest beings of an impressive scale. Now, let's be fair, bone fragmentary preservation and taphonomic distortion can mislead measurements. Enlargements can be illusions created by mineral accretions or by mistaken association of bones from different species. Cave ecosystems import animal bones, bears, deer, ibex, and careful comparative anatomy is required. Some peers argue that the giant bones actually include ursid or large bovine fragments misidentified under poor preservation conditions. Yet the carved stones remain compelling. The prints were intentionally incised, and their scale is consistent across multiple slabs. The stratigraphy places them beneath layers with domestic refuse, indicating these images are not late romanticizations but integral to the cave's ritual life. The slabs also carry parallel inscriptions, short lines that mention names and debts and refer to visitors who gave grain for the marking. The sensorial effect is eerie, inputting a palm into a carved impression, then imagining a hand so large that it could carry an ox, elicits the mythic reflex we have enjoyed since childhood when storytellers describe giants and sky people. Different interpretive camps emerge again. The skeptical biologists argue for misidentification and taphonomic distortion. The symbolists insist the oversized handprints are deliberate image magic. Making space for a bigger-than-human presence inside a domestic shrine is a rhetorical move designed to channel power. The hybrid hypothesis attempts a middle path. Perhaps the cave was a sanctuary devoted to memory of larger-than-life ancestors, tumultuous forebears whose deeds were represented with enlarged effigies to mark their social significance, not their literal size. A small, daring group of archaeological mythographers raised the possibility that the cave preserved memory accounts of giants, who were described in later myth as foes or as primordial laborers who shaped valleys. Whether literal or symbolic, the cave's artifacts force us to confront the way scale gets used in human storytelling. Making the sacred physically larger is a way of literally giving it space in the human environment. Imagine lowering yourself into the cave throat with a lantern, the light sputtering against calcite flowstone, your breath visible in the chill. The slabs are stacked like pages in a forbidden book. The incised prints catch the lamplight, shadows pooling in their grooves. A fragment of bone lies half buried under soot, mineral-streaked, and when you touch it your fingers leave oily tracery. The human wonder here is visceral, the desire to make the unknown visible by enlarging it, to make divinity and dread touchable by magnifying the scale. Whatever the explanation, ritual exaggeration, misidentified fauna, or something stranger, the cave insists on a social project, the translation of awe into monument. We still don't know if the hands were those of ancestors remembered as giants, of beings from the sky, or if they were a symbolic language that let people negotiate prowess and lineage in a violent mountain ecology. We leave the high places and descend into an earth that is soft with peat and moonlit bogs, into burial mounds laid out like a calendar. The teaser is seductive. The tumuli are aligned to the stars in ways that suggest an ancient astronomical cult that kept a ledger of the fallen as if they were celestial bodies. The mounds sit on a plain where the horizon to the northeast opens to a narrow band of sky. Alignments show that on 2 days of the year the sun rises directly over the apex of a particular mound, casting a long spear of light across a line of stelae. Dating places the burials between 1800 and 1200 BC, and the construction is precise. The central mound rises to roughly 3.8 meters with a diameter of 28 meters, surrounded by a ring of smaller cairns at intervals of about 12 degrees, measured carefully by surveyors. Inside the burial chambers were deposits that include metal blades, polished mirrors, and bone combs, along with thin engraved plates that read like star lists, names matched with celestial descriptions, commodities, and phrases such as the flap of wings, and the ledger of those who fell at dawn. Astronomers and archaeologists together have been mapping these alignments and the plates' lists and are struck by correspondences. Some names match asterisms visible in the late Bronze Age horizon, others match nothing known. The plate's language uses a mix of calendrical terms and vernacular descriptors. Night of thin milk, season when reeds burn, that root celestial observations in local life. This blending of sky and earth implies a cosmology where certain celestial events were read as moral or social registers. Meteors might be fallen beings enacted in ritual, comets could be omens of hybrid births, and lunar eclipses might be days when the borders thinned and a different social order was possible. Now, let's be fair, humans have always mapped meaning onto the sky, and alignment does not prove belief in visitors from above. Alignments could function as mnemonic devices for agricultural cycles or as power claims by elites who controlled calendrical knowledge. Yet the inscriptions intertwine celestial mapping with social bookkeeping in ways that make purely practical readings awkward. The mound's construction required labor coordination and a shared narrative. Someone had to insist these alignments mattered enough to shape stone. Picture standing on the plain at twilight, the mounds shadowing the lowering sun, the first stars appearing like pins pricked in cloth. Walk the line between cairns and imagine the laborers, rope and wooden frames, lifting stones while their chants named the sky. Hold a thin plate and read a line. X fell, give to the keeper of reed, record in the ledger. The sensory association is powerful, sky as archive and archive as social ledger. The wonder here is how people turn the heavens into bureaucrats, making celestial events accountable to human institutions. This is an intimacy of scale and meaning. We, like them, make systems to measure the incalculable. We still don't know whether those named in the plates are remembered human leaders, poetic metaphors for celestial phenomena, or references to something that was both social actor and astral sign. At every site, the desert archive, the cave of large hands, the mound calendar, the tablets and inscriptions refuse simple categorization. They demand that we think of the ancient world not as neatly divided into the sacred and the profane but as a braided continuum where law, pedagogy, ritual, and cosmic mapping coexisted and cross-pollinated. Each artifact, each brittle shard, draws us into a small, urgent conversation about who taught whom, who owned what, and how a community made the strange familiar. Yet every time we attempt to translate the strange into the familiar, the texts nudge back, offering counter-histories and insisting on their own internal logic. We keep reading because the pages promise more, and they keep refusing full closure. We still don't know whether the ledger was a record of debt, of blessing, or of a contract signed in a tongue whose grammar we only half recover. The next mystery leads us into a river delta thick with reeds and the slow music of mosquitoes, an ancient wetland city whose submerged warehouses yielded tablets sealed in resin and an astonishing set of anatomical diagrams. The one-sentence tease is unnerving. The city kept lessons on the body as if it were both temple and laboratory, and the drawings pair human anatomy with schematic wings. The delta site, flooded and refilled over centuries, dates broadly to the late 1st millennium BC, roughly 700 to 300 BC, when competing polities fought for control of river mouths and the commerce they funneled inland. Excavation trenches cut through layers of peat and packed reed mat floors. Superb preservation in anoxic layers produced not just pottery and loom weights, but bundles wrapped in tarry cloth, inside which lay papyrus-like sheets and thin hammered plates of copper. On these surfaces are careful line drawings, muscles and tendons annotated with words that suggest function and metaphor. Wingbinder, breath catch, spine of flight. Some plates portray schematic limb articulations not as the purely biological joints we would expect, but as hybrid contrivances in which sinew and strap, feather and hinge, are diagrammed together. The technicalness is striking. The grammar of these inscriptions moves from observation to instruction, as if an artisan and a physician had sat together to copy a single text. But here's where it gets tricky. The Delta is not an isolated island of curiosity. Its material culture shows clear links to inland metropolises. Seals on some stored jars carry the emblem of a well-known southern city-state. Metallurgical slag contains trace elements from the western highlands. And among the diagrams are not just anatomy notes, but careful lists of tools, bone awls, bronze pins, thin chains of woven hair. The context suggests practical manipulations, corsetry, prosthetics, and perhaps ritual modification. Yet the diagram's rhetorical flourishes complicate the utilitarian reading. One plate describes a procedure to bind the shoulder to hold the sky. Another speaks of unwinding the bone to make room for breath. These are technical metaphors, but they are metaphors that carry the weight of belief. They suggest that modification of the human body could be a way to bridge orders of being, a technology aimed at altering social personhood as much as physiological function. Now, let's be fair, bodies have always been sites of social engineering, tattooing, cranial shaping, foot binding, ear stretching, so a set of diagrams that combine tool and flesh may reflect a local practice of embodied identity. The possibility that some interventions made movement feel different, lighter, more buoyant, could be an exaggeration of therapeutic outcomes or a ritualized description of coming-of-age alterations. Skeptics will point to the natural human tendency to embellish outcomes. A child who learns to swim well becomes, in folk speech, someone touched by the sea, a metaphor that can be misread as literal. Yet when similar diagrams are found across multiple strata and on different mediums, on copper plates, on Tarsus-bonded parchment, and in painted neurofragments, the repetition suggests a shared, stable practice rather than an occasional metaphor. Ethnohistorical analogies hint at techniques that could alter gait or shoulder tension, making movement appear more gliding than trudging. Whether those techniques produced anything like the levity we imagine is uncertain. What is clear is that this community invested knowledge, ritual, and craft into the body itself. Competing interpretations branch out. The prosthetic functionalists argue these plates record advanced medical knowledge, orthopedic techniques, post-injury adaptations, even early prosthetics fashioned from wood and bronze. The ritual embodiers read the diagrams as initiatory manuals. Altering the body is a rite, a way of symbolically marking a person as touched by another order. The transmission theorists highlight the plate's technical overlap with shipbuilding manuals found upriver, suggesting cross-pollination between technologies of buoyancy and technologies of bodily modification, an intriguing, mechanistic explanation that would have the Delta's artisans borrow structural principles from boat carpenters to imagine human movement. Finally, the most imaginative, and most contested, reading posits that these diagrams were literal manuals for making bodies that could perform aerial motion, preserved in hyperbolic technical language by scribes who wanted to give their rituals the dignity of engineering. Whatever the truth, the plates force us to rethink our definitions: what counts as technology, what counts as ritual, and where the two meet. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the silted quay as dusk floods the marsh with indigo. The peat smells sweet and metallic. Tiny bioluminescent insects flicker where the water runs shallow. You pick up a hammered plate and trace the careful incisions with your thumb. The grooves are shallow but confident, as if made by a practiced hand. Imagine a workshop inside a low-roofed house, where a healer and a woodworker argue gently over the dimensions of a brace. An elderly woman hums a chant about the sky as a child practices a new gait, half-step, half-glide. The human wonder here is grim and delicate. People turning the body into an instrument of social belonging and spiritual passage, using craft to shape not just function but belonging, to invent ways of being that carry both physical consequence and cosmological meaning. We still don't know whether those handcrafted devices ever produced flight, literal or figurative, or whether they function purely within a symbolic economy that reshapes status and identity. Our final mystery segment is the most modern-seeming and painfully intimate, a compact urban quarter where, beneath the foundations of later buildings, graffiti-like marginalia and formal legal tablets together create a conversation between state and street about forbidden knowledge. The teaser is immediate. The neighborhood kept a ledger of transgressions, and the margins of legal slabs are filled with insults, sketches, and what appear to be eyewitness notations of encounters with winged figures on the city's roofs. This late antique to early medieval quarter, dated to roughly 300 to 700 CE, sits at a crossroads of imperial politics. The archaeological matrix includes coins, tesserae, amphorae, and a dense scatter of small lead tablets. Some appear to be municipal records, others personal contracts. A curious feature is the way public legal tablets sometimes bear marginal scratches, shorthand comments, cross-outs, and doodles that reflect the friction between official law and local rumor. Among these were several small incised plates that read, in blunt, streetwise script, like eyewitness sketches. Midnight, light on the tower, claws on the sill, she bore a child in spring. Another note reads, Keeper of the baths, do not let him in when he has feathers, he stinks of salt. Now, let's be fair, marginalia are notoriously playful and unreliable. A bored clerk scratches demons on the edge of a tax ledger. A snide neighbor carves a smear of gossip. Rumor grows. But the pattern at this quarter is strikingly consistent. Multiple independent hands in different layers make similar claims, and some of the later municipal responses suggest institutions felt the need to legislate these rumors into law. A municipal decree, fragmentary but legible, prohibits the sheltering of those who come at night with feathers, and prescribes a fine for anyone who gives hearth to the stranger with a wing. Why would an administration codify such a decree unless the claims had tangible social effect? If people were altering social practice in response to stories. Even a cynical reading must concede that the law recognized a phenomenon worth policing, whether the phenomenon was metaphoric, forbidden cults, secret societies, or literal, unusual itinerants whose dress and rites offended civic norms. Different interpretive lenses consider different mechanisms. The social anthropologists suggest the wings are a metaphor for subversion, outsiders who wore capes or masks, or who used bird imagery to mark a sect. The psychological culturalists read the graffiti as projection. A city under stress invents predators to cast blame for social anxieties, plague, famine, waves of migration. The legal historical school finds in the municipal response evidence of a polity struggling to incorporate heterodox persons, adopting law to contain rumor, and, in so doing, making rumor part of the archival record. The most daring, and the most speculative, reads the graffiti as contemporaneous reportage of outlandish visitors, figures who, in the popular imagination, were winged enough to be called feathers, while the administrative text showed the slow, bureaucratic attempt to domesticate and punish what the rumor named. Picture the city at dusk, rooftops and chimneys, cats threading between tiles, toddlers pressing their faces to the window at night. You, moving through narrow alleys, read a scratched plate and feel the immediacy of someone who lived there, someone who crossed the threshold between the mundane ledger and the loud, rumor-heavy margins of the civic record. The human wonder here is communal. How ordinary documents, contracts, fines, tax lists, become the stage where society negotiates boundaries of belonging and where rumor acquires civic consequence. We still don't know whether the wings were literal, metaphorical, or a social code for something else entirely, and the municipal marginalia keep the debate deliciously messy. Across these segments, the stone circle, the harbor, the desert archive, the cave shrine, the mound calendar, the delta laboratory, the urban quarter, we have moved through a panorama of human strategies for integrating, resisting, and accounting for what appears to have crossed the border between ordinary life and something else. Each place supplies its own grammar, columns of breaths, legal clauses, pedagogical fragments, oversized handprints, star lists, body diagrams, and city graffiti. Each grammar insists, in its own way, on translating the uncanny into manageable language: ledger, law, lesson, monument, alignment, diagram, and margin. And each, finally, leaves us with an open line, a scribe's aside, a scratched margin. We still don't know. So what do we carry forward into the final chapter of this journey? The short answer is, questions. But those questions are not idle. They are the methodological tools we must apply if we want to be honest consumers of the past. First, do not let the modern demand for tidy causal chains flatten complexity. Cultural interactions are rarely linear. Goods move, people move, and ideas hitchhike on both. The consequence is networks of meaning that twist and braid in ways our neat categories cannot always capture. Second, recognize the rhetorical power of texts. Words matter, whether inscribed in clay, copper, bark, or lead. They are not transparent windows into belief. They are crafted performances, meant to persuade, to bureaucratize, to enshrine, or to mock. Learn to read them as performances with social functions. Third, respect the material record. The fragments, the isotopes, the stratigraphies are not mere footnotes. They are constraints on speculation. A theory that ignores metallurgical traces or osteological realities is a theory that will not survive engagement with the ledger of the earth. Now, let us be fair. There are limits to what archaeology and philology can tell us. The past is not merely lost information waiting to be decoded. It is a series of discontinuities in which people changed, forgetfulness accumulated, and new categories were invented to make sense of novelty. Oral traditions shift, metaphors fossilize into dogma. A ritual that once required a hand-carved plate becomes the basis for a law that outlives the practice. Yet within these discontinuities we glimpse continuity, small human responses to shock and wonder. Someone engraved an enlarged palm into a slab because they wanted to make art tangible. Someone wrote a municipal fine about feathers because rumor affected daily life. Someone diagrammed the shoulder to teach a child to move differently because that movement conferred belonging. These acts are the same in all times. They are human attempts to manage the unmanageable by making it legible. If we step back and look across these sites, an image begins to cohere, not a proof of angels and monsters, but a human project of boundary management. The tablets and inscriptions are instruments in that project, legal codices that normalize hybridity, pedagogical fragments that domesticate dangerous knowledge, diagrams that prescribe new embodiments, monuments that make the sacred physically large, lists that stitch sky to soil. The beings the texts name, fallen, feathered, winged, teacher, are personifications of boundary crossing. They name the anxiety and the fascination that attended contact, with strangers, with technologies, with novel bodies, with celestial phenomena. They are our ancestors' words for the experience of being shaken into new social forms. And yet the question persists because it is not merely academic. The nature of boundary crossing then bears directly on who had agency, who paid the costs, and who benefited. If the fallen were remembered as teachers who brought horticulture and weaving, then certain groups gained capacities that reshaped power. If they were regarded as predators who took children or stole law, then their memory justified exclusion and punishment. If they were both, at once disruptive and productive, then the story of human social formation becomes messy and far more human. These are not abstract stakes. They are the contingency of how communities survive change. Picture yourself at the end of a long walk through these sites, the light low and the air full of late-day insects. You are tired, palms damp, thoughts swollen with images, pillars and harbor keys, bark sheets and copper plates, slabs with oversized handprints, and thin municipal tablets with scratched marginalia. You have held the objects close enough to trace marks with your thumb. You have learned to feel the weight of an inscription and the lightness of rumor. The human wonder that will remain with you is the same one that animated the people who made those traces. A stubborn hope that by naming and recording, by aligning stone to star and body to craft, we can make sense of what frightens and beguiles us. We keep writing to keep being human. So where do we go from here? We keep digging, not because we expect to find simple answers but because the act of digging refines our questions. Each new tablet might complicate a tidy hypothesis or might fold several theories into one unwieldy truth. The past resists being reduced to moral parables. It prefers to be messy and alive. Our work, then, is to remain disciplined enough to let method guide us, generous enough to let wonder teach us, and skeptical enough to keep faith with evidence even when it demands uncomfortable rethinking. Remember, the tablets we have read are not relics of a single worldview but palimpsests of conversation across centuries. The scribe who counted breaths is in dialogue with the municipal clerk who scratched a rumor into a tax ledger, and both are part of a longer human attempt to place overwhelming experience into the service of community. They record fear, commerce, pedagogy, spectacle, law, and humor. They show us how societies incorporate the unbidden, through sanction if necessary, through ritual if convenient, and through invention whenever possible. At the end of the day, the big revelation is not that there exist beings of another order walking our earth. That would be a tidy, tempting headline. But that human beings, ever inventive, have always had strategies for dealing with the unfamiliar. Those strategies tell us more about us than about the beings we name. They reveal how we allocate blame and honor, how we make legal space for new persons, how we teach children to be part of the social fabric, and how we carve the sky into entries for an impossible ledger. They also remind us of our humility. Language fails often in the face of the uncanny, and when it does, people improvise, writing lists, inscribing plates, drawing hands larger than life. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.